Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Josh Schwartz and Leon Parker. They're from the Wren Collective, and we're going to be talking a lot about public defense because a new study just came out, California Public Defense Workloads and Staffing, which I think is going to be quite damning. I was mentioning right before we got on the air that in a lot of ways, California has a really strong public defense system, but obviously this shows that even in strong systems, there's a lot that needs to be done. So welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, glad to be here, David.
So maybe you guys can kind of introduce yourselves individually and also tell people what the Wren Collective is.
Sure. I am a former public defender. I started in New Orleans doing trial level public defense, and then was a public defender in New York, and then came back to Louisiana, where I'm based, doing capital work and representing folks who had been sentenced to life without parole as kids. And I've been at the Ren Collective now for a little over a year and a half. We are a policy and communications organization that focuses on looking for solutions and reforms to the criminal legal system to help build safer and healthier communities, communities where we invest in measures that actually are proven to reduce crime and make everyone safer and keep families together rather than trying the sort of tired, disproven methods that have been so pervasive throughout our history.
And Leon?
Yeah, Leon Parker. I was a federal defender in Pittsburgh, the Western District of Pennsylvania, and then I moved to Detroit in 2019, where I joined the federal defender's office there. And then I've been with Ren for the last year and a half or so. Don't have too much to add to Josh's description. I think he perfectly summed up what we do at Ren. But I will say that one of my big motivations for becoming a PD was just trying to alleviate a lot of the racial disparities that I witnessed and experienced as a kid growing up. And so, one of the things I really enjoy about Ren is that the solutions we're working towards, clearly making communities safer, but also addressing some of the very intentional and systemic racism that permeates our system.
Great. Well, and the report that just came out, I got to give a shout out to Malia Brink, who's a longtime associate and friend from her days at the Bar Association and all her great work that she did over there. But what was the major finding in this report?
California radically and dramatically under-resources public defense at the state level. We're one of two states that provide no statewide standards or funding for trial level public defense. And so that means it's all on the counties to figure it out on their own. The result of which is that when you look statewide, we spend 77% more on prosecution than we do on public defense. What this study did is it broke down that disparity and looked at how it actually affects staffing levels in a really interesting way. And it found that there are about 1,000 more lawyers working as prosecutors than public defenders in the state of California. And when you look at things like support staff that lawyers need to do their work, the disparity is even bigger. There's almost 4,000, about 3,700 more people working as support staff for prosecutors than as public defenders. I think they talk about high caseloads, flat fee contracts, which I'm sure we'll get into in a little bit. But I think the broader point is that California now has a very clear warning about what the problems are in the public defense system. This was a massive multi-year legislative study, but it comes on the heels of 5 detailed studies of counties in the past 5 years that found pretty shocking problems, lawyers with caseloads in the hundreds and hundreds of felonies. It comes on the heels of a report by the Office of the State Public Defender highlighting some of these same disparities. And it also comes on the heels of our report where we looked under the hood at flat fee contracts, this sort of privatized public defense system that is in use in many, many counties in California. And so we now know what the problems are. And the question for California going forward is how are we going to actually fix it?
Well, I want to start with this because, I remember, I don't know, 15 years ago when I started looking into a lot of this stuff, nominally it looked like in most counties, public defenders and prosecutor offices were funded about the same. But then once you started to unpack that, you quickly realized that that was just kind of I don't know how I would describe it. I don't know if it's nefarious, but it's definitely a little bit of an illusion. And can you explain why that is the case?
Yeah, I mean, David, I certainly don't want to speculate, but I would say for most counties that we've studied and even had conversation with some people in managerial positions, it's just a matter of priorities. As Josh said, when the state is not providing any dollars, then it falls on counties, especially counties that have a limited tax base. Public defense is not at the top of the list in terms of priorities for funding. So that tends to be one of the first things they look at. How can we contain cost? And everybody wants to, you know, be perceived as safe. And they equate safety with giving money to cops and district attorneys and not public defenders, which is backwards for a lot of reasons. Because when we talk about the system and the cost of incarcerating people, you have the fiscal cost. So counties think they're saving money on the front end, but when you look at lengthier periods of incarceration, people being detained unnecessarily, it costs taxpayers a lot of money. And then there's just the argument that by getting people, connecting people, I should say, to resources, which is what public defenders can do with mitigation specialists and investigators, you can really address the genesis of a lot of issues which are tied to addiction and trauma. But we have this very, I don't know, we kind of have our head in the sand when it comes to safety on these things. So I think that's why I don't think it's nefarious. I just don't think people really appreciate how a strong public defense system is in the best interest of everyone.
And to kind of tie into that, we're actually asking public defenders to do a lot more now than maybe 15, 20 years ago. When I first started doing this, most public defenders' offices didn't have people like social workers and they didn't do the holistic defense. And so, a lot of people don't understand that, public defenders aren't just there to, plead somebody out and or maybe occasionally take somebody to trial. They actually are trying to help people get back on their feet so they don't end up back in the system. But all that takes money and resources.
It does, but I think it saves money in the end for counties. I mean, counties spend about 6 times as much on incarceration as they do in public defense statewide. That disparity is much bigger in a lot of counties throughout the state. But California as a whole spends about 19 times as much on incarceration as it does on public defense. And when you spend a little bit more upfront on public defense and you invest in giving attorneys those resources like social workers, where they can get someone set up with mental health or substance use treatment and sort of break the cycle of incarceration, you end up saving so much more money on the back end because the incarceration budget is massive. Santa Cruz County is a great example of this, where they switched to a full-time public defender's office a few years ago, and they were able to see a drop in their jail population, which has a money-saving effect far greater than any increase in public defense resources.
I mean, you can peel back layers here. So, I mean, when you say district attorneys' offices have 191% more support staff than public defenders, does that even include like law enforcement and that, or is it just people actually in the DA staff?
I don't believe it includes law enforcement. That's a whole separate. And then when you
Right.
talk about, sheriff's offices Incarceration, that's a whole separate piece of the budget.
I figured that was the case, but that just gives you an idea that we're talking a tiny sliver of this picture. So what is it that the report recommends to fix some of this stuff?
I'm going to let Josh jump in, but the easy answer is money. I mean, that's what's needed. Statewide funding, Josh said at the top of the conversation, it's one of two states. California is one of two states that doesn't provide state funding. And in our research, we see states across the political spectrum that are providing statewide funding. It's a matter of resources, but to kind of piggyback on some things Josh has talked about is we're going to be going out to California in the coming weeks. And in Santa Clara, for example, they started an early representation program to make sure that clients are seen within 48 hours. And then unfortunately, the county defunded that program. But the results were clear that it was helping clients and reducing pretrial incarceration. So when we just talk about creative means to increase the quality of our public defense system. Again, everything goes back to funds and money. One of the things, I don't want to jump ahead, that we talk about in our flat fee report is just a distinction between having institutional public defender offices versus flat fee contract systems. And again, don't want to rehash this, but the concern with counties is always the upfront cost. But again, if you look at the entire picture, there's a lot of data and evidence that indicates that having a properly resourced, and I really want to stress that, a properly resourced PD office can save the county money and improve public safety. So it's dollars and cents, and there's a lot going on. And we talk about money for people accused of crimes. That's not at the top of the list, and we're not even getting into all the immigration-related issues and how having a quality public defense system can alleviate some of those issues. So it boils down to money. But Josh may have some more particulars in terms of recommendations, but ultimately that's what's needed.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, California has, at the state level, ignored this issue for far too long. And I think the report should be a pretty stark warning. And it does also recommend, we talk a lot about flat fee contracts, and just to make that clear for everyone, when you get a public defender, it could be someone who works as a full-time public defender in an office that is set up by the county. But in a lot of counties in California, that could be someone who is basically a private lawyer or firm at a for-profit entity that is given a contract with the county. And California uses these, what they call flat fee contracts in many counties, which pay a fixed amount for a limitless amount of cases. So this is a practice that has been long criticized in California. And this new report calls very clearly for it to be banned. And there's actually legislation pending, AB 690 in California that would finally do that. It's long been talked about as a problem. But like Leon said, at its core, it's a problem about a lack of resources to public defenders.
And I'm going to get into the flat fee thing in a minute because I agree it's a big problem. But, one of the problems that we have in California is, of course, you can talk about money, but California, is perpetually either running a deficit or, they're not investing in money for this type of thing. And that's a problem. But the other problem is there needs to be kind of a narrative change so that legislators and county officials can kind of understand the importance of investing money at this phase of the criminal justice system, as opposed to, to incarcerate people or for law enforcement. And that's going to take a narrative change. What are you thinking in terms of what's the winning argument, I guess, for lack of a better question?
That's a tough one. I think when we've approached more conservative districts, we try to lead with the fiscal argument of just, this is the amount of money you're spending. Josh may have mentioned it, but I believe between counties and cities, California spent over $23 billion on incarceration. So billion dollars. So that's what we lead with. But I think at its core, you talk about the fiscal argument, you talk about the safety argument that long term, getting people connected with the right resources can address the genesis of a lot of crimes. So in terms of reframing that narrative, we just equate safety with locking people up, and we've been doing that for centuries. And when the people we're locking up are disproportionately Black and brown, it's always a hard argument to tell people to stop locking up people who look a certain way. I suspect if California's demographic looked different, we may have more success, just being frank. But I think it takes time, and I think we have a tendency to be exhausted when we don't get immediate results. But this has been centuries in the making, and it's going to take centuries to undo this. So I think there's a level of persistence and stamina that we have to approach this with. And we have examples that we can point to. And so I think it's just really drilling in that narrative, not just to people who are elected officials, but to citizens, everyday citizens, to give them an appreciation of why this isn't working, particularly citizens who are in heavily policed areas. We're talking about safety, and things don't look that differently than what they look like in your parents' generation or your grandparents' generation. So we have an abundance of empirical and just observational evidence that things need to change. But you've been drilling the same message for centuries, so it just takes time and patience to undo it. And I think the work Ren and other great groups are doing is just we're taking steps and really just trying to have consistency with this messaging, knowing that it's going to be a long-term issue.
And let me expound on what Leon just said, because I happen to have some numbers to throw out there. So California K through 12 spends about $12,000 a year per pupil. In the higher education system in California, which is probably the best in the world, that may go up to $40,000. But we're spending $100,000 to $150,000 per year to lock people up. And so the most expensive solution to this safety problem is to actually lock people up. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It also doesn't work very well. So maybe, Josh, you can jump in on that point.
Sure, and I am a product of California's public education system, and so it stings to hear those disparities laid out. But you know, what I can say is, if you look at what is going on around us in the country right now, now is the time we need to ensure that our public defense system is up to code. We have, the criminal system has long been used as a dragnet for the immigration system, right? Non-citizens who are pulled into the criminal court with sort of petty low-level charges are then facing the life sentence of deportation once they are handed over to the immigration system. That has now been turbocharged. We have, we've seen arrests of protesters, the criminalization of dissent, and all of these things should be deeply concerning. California sort of holds itself out there as the model of sort of fighting back against this march towards fascism, right? But we're really ignoring this key area where on the front lines are those lawyers who are going to be representing people in criminal court when they are arrested either at a protest or they are an immigrant who is pulled in with this sort of low-level crime dragnet, and now is facing not only deportation and a life sentence, but deportation to some torture prison in a country that they've never known. And so everything has become turbocharged, everything is more extreme, and I think it only highlights more the need for California to act now. The disparity you cited in spending is absolutely upside down. And so we need to completely rethink how we approach this issue. And that is going to require putting a lot more resources towards public defense, especially if we're going to try and hold ourselves out there as this sort of model for pushing back against fascism as a state.
Yeah, so let's get into the flat fee issue. And I don't know if you know this, but I already did an interview with Ren a couple of months ago when the flat fee study came out. But we see this all the time, even within counties, because most counties in California, they have a public defender system, which, is relatively well funded. The folks are basically, on salary, and they have money for investigations, which is actually one of the more costly aspects of indigent defense. But most counties also have a conflict system where it's generally private counsel that are on contract, and you can tell the difference county to county between the public defenders and the people that are on that system for the most part. And I don't know if it's a funding thing or a pay thing, but it seems to me that the quality of attorneys are not quite on par. And then there are other counties which tend to be smaller and more rural that aren't big enough to have their own private public defender office. And so, they rely on basically contracted counsel. And it's a perverse system. Like, I remember talking to an attorney who went up to Placer County, which is relatively more rural than Sacramento, which is more urban. And she was like fighting to the teeth for her client, and everybody's watching her because nobody ever does that up there, apparently. And she's like, no, this is how I always behave. And like all these people were coming up to her and going, wow, you should represent me. And that's sad in a way, right? I mean, like these are people's lives that are in the balance, and they're not getting top-notch defense at times.
Yeah, where to start? So what I want to start with is there are a lot of quality attorneys in flat fee systems. The problem, in my opinion, is not so much the attorneys, it's the system. The system incentivizes mediocrity. If you have a contract for $100,000 and you have, 100,000 cases, you can only spend a little bit of time per case. And if you spend over that amount of time, you're losing money. So it disincentivizes people from hiring an investigator, doing mitigation, doing motions. They are literally trying to push clients into pleas as quickly as possible because that is what is most beneficial when you're running a business. So it's set up for attorneys to do a mediocre job. It's set up for there to be, subsequent post-conviction ineffective assistance of counsel claims. So as long as you have that system designed that way, it's incredibly problematic. Um, Josh, I give him an abundance of credit. He really spearheaded a report that we did alongside some other great partners in California. And when we studied these contracts, we were finding that most did not contain anything that would allow for contract attorneys to easily procure the services of an investigator or mitigation specialist. You had to either go through a lot of red tape, which again costs people time and money, or you had to ask the court to sign off on funding, which again, you're trying to keep this contract. So going to the county and asking for more money is not generally something most contract attorneys are going to do. And I'm not even talking about the fact that most of these contract attorneys are allowed to have their own outside private paying clients who they're going to prioritize because it's more profitable to prioritize them. So it's a system that harms clients. Regardless of how well intentioned the attorney is, it's generally just not feasible to do a good job in that system. So you have these legal deserts in rural areas where it's really difficult for them to attract young, talented attorneys. And the results are just really perverse, and they exacerbate a lot of the issues that have permeated our criminal system. We talk about in flat fee counties, they have clients are more likely to be detained for lengthy periods of time, more likely to be convicted. Their sentences are longer than a comparable county with institutional public defender offices. Josh may have mentioned it. I think 8 of the top 10 counties, when we talk about incarceration rates, are flat fee counties, including the top 5. So it's just a really problematic system. And you talked about earlier, why is there such a gap between, a place like San Francisco, for example, it has a strong PD office in a flat fee county. It's just PDs have the resources. You have a salary, you know what you're getting paid. So you can actually dig into a case and do your best, and you're not sweating over, should I go to trial? Because that's going to cost me money. Should I file this motion? Should I do this hearing? You can do it the right way when you're in a properly resourced PD office. And there's oversight, David. There are people actually checking to make sure you're visiting your client and you're filing what should be a very obvious Fourth Amendment claim. And when we study these contracts in flat fee counties, we didn't see a lot of oversight in the vast majority of the contracts we studied. So it's just a system that's premised on saving money. But beyond the humanitarian cost, it costs more money because we're incarcerating people unnecessarily. So yeah.
Yeah, so let me just clarify, was not intending to disparage any individual attorneys. That was not my point. But I do feel like the system doesn't represent people well. One of my favorite examples comes from Josh's neck of the woods, actually Alabama, close by. The case of Anthony Ray Hinton, who was wrongly convicted of murder in the early 1980s. And at that time, Alabama had this flat fee system where they basically paid an attorney who had never tried a criminal case in his life $1,000 to defend a guy in a capital case. And he comes to meet Anthony Ray Hinton in prison, and he basically says, I'm only getting paid $1,000 for this, and I eat $1,000 for breakfast. And to add insult to injury, they only gave him $500 for investigators. And apparently he didn't know, and this was one of the areas where they were able to actually get the sentence overturned. He didn't know that he could actually go to the judge, as Leon had mentioned, and request more money. He got a forensic guy who had only one eye to do the ballistics testing. Needless to say, it didn't work well. And Anthony spent 39 years in prison as an innocent man. But that just, kind of, I know it's an extreme example, and we don't really see that here in California on that level. But that's the absurdity that we're looking at.
Absolutely. And I mean, there are, for every story like that we know about, there are so many stories out there that we don't know about because that person is just still sitting in a jail cell, wrongfully convicted. I mean, we know we get it wrong. Having worked on those cases and represented folks who have been exonerated, we know that we get it wrong, and we get it egregiously wrong. And in California, you want to talk about lack of investigators, about half of ineffective assistance of counsel cases, the claim involves a lack of investigation. And so what we found in our report, when we looked at the actual contracts that these counties that rely exclusively on flat fees to privatize their system are using for lawyers, only 6 of the 24 we looked at actually accounted for investigators and how the contracts were set up. 6 of the 24. There's been a lot of great reporting out of Cal Matters recently about the lack of investigators in California, and the AB 625 report talks about it at length as well. There's just a massive shortage of investigator resources. And we know what that means. It means people are going to be wrongfully convicted. And like Leon said earlier, those people are overwhelmingly going to be Black and brown Californians who are sitting in jail cells when they never committed a crime. And it is an absolute travesty, and it's something that our state absolutely needs to address.
And just to add to that point, I believe in the Anthony Ray Hinton case, that left an actual perpetrator out who committed another murder. So So, this isn't just, a justice thing, although I think the justice component is very strong, don't get me wrong, but it's also a public safety thing that if you have the wrong guy locked up, that means that the right guy is running around potentially committing new crimes, and that's a public safety risk. So, I mean, other than money, what is it that we can do?
Well, as Just said at the top of the conversation, a lot of what we do at Ren is related around communications work and educating and enlightening people on all the systemic issues within our system. So I think part of it is, platforms like this where we can talk about these issues that I suspect the average Californian is not fully aware of. Showing people the numbers, these gaudy numbers, showing people examples of what it looks like to have a strong public defense system and the dividends that pays in terms of safety and dollars out of your bank account, you know. So I think it's really a big education system, outside of more money. I think education is a big thing. And I think there has to be, frankly, some public shaming because I'm not from California. I actually visited the state for the first time this year, and I always had this perception of California, this kind of liberal, I don't want to say paradise, but ahead of the curve versus the rest of the country. And then you study this system, and it's like this is terrible. There are states that we dog for their politics that have better indigent defense systems than California. So if we're going to put ourselves out there as the best of the best when it comes to treating people the right way, how we treat individuals who have the least, the disinherited, the disenfranchised, that's really the measure of how well you're doing as a society. And from that measure, California's doing really, really poorly. So I think there has to be some public shaming and again, education of citizens who can pressure their elected representatives to do better. And so that was a lot of what was behind the campaign of AB 690, which is a bill that Josh mentioned earlier to ban flat fee contracts. That's a bit of a esoteric issue that a lot of people don't really fully appreciate, but you boil it down to you're getting subpar representation and more people from your community are getting locked up. You put it in terms like that, people get behind it. So I think a lot of this is just education because a lot of people don't think of public defense when they think about how can I make my society better. A lot of people don't have great perceptions of public defenders, but we are kind of the first line of defense if you are, charged by the system. So tying in public defense to quality of life, I think is something that's been missing when we talk about public defenders.
And I wanted to bring up one more issue before we have to go here, and we haven't really discussed it, but the workload standard, and I think most people can understand that if you're a public defender and you have 100 clients, you can't pay as much attention to each individual client as you probably should. It seems like pretty cut and dry, and yet, even in counties like LA, I know the workload is like at least 100 and maybe more.
Right. I mean, that is a massive problem. And every time an individual county has been studied in recent years, they've seen caseloads in the hundreds of felonies at a time. And sort of back to our earlier point about how the lawyers are a product of the system that they're in. I worked as a public defender in a system that was severely under-resourced, where I had 150 felony cases. And then you see these stories coming out of California counties where those numbers are 250, 300. I can't imagine having 300 felony cases at a time. I just can't. I mean, 150 was bad enough and was eye-popping. So caseloads are really important to keep in check. What we found in our report when we looked at flat fee counties is none of them had any sort of caseload standards whatsoever. One of the big problems in California that the AB 625 study pointed out is there's no statewide data system for keeping track of this stuff. So well, you could have some counties that keep track of their attorney cases. You can have a lot of counties where those lawyers are private law, private contractors with their own firm, or solo practitioners, and no one knows how many cases they have at once. And so there's no centralized way for tracking that. So that means there's no centralized way for tracking, say, case outcomes, right? Are these lawyers outliers? Are they doing a much worse job than other lawyers in the same system? There are all these different things that would come from having better data. California is supposed to be the technology capital of the world, right? Silicon Valley, right? We should be able to have good, accessible data on what is going on in the counties with their public defense systems. And we really don't right now. And it's a massive problem.
Yeah, I think we could do a whole segment on all the things that California claims to be that it's not. And we could talk for hours on that subject. So we need to wrap up here. We've been talking with Leon Parker and Josh Schwartz from the Wren Collective. How can people learn more about these reports? You guys do a lot of amazing work, and I think it needs to be amplified and highlighted. Not enough people know who the Wren Collective is.
Well, we appreciate that. You can certainly go to our website and find all of our reports. And there is a website that I think hopefully we can have something posted in the comments. We'll get you the web address for our campaign on indigent defense reform in California, and the Justice for All campaign. So Justice for All California, to find out more information about this fight.
Well, that's it for this episode. We've been talking with the Wren Collective about public defense in California. It is a critical issue, and unfortunately, it's going to only get more critical in the next 3 years as the pressure amps up even further. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.